It was a typical summer evening when my friends and I made the reckless decision to sneak out. We were bored and seeking adventure, and what better place to find it than in the dark, mysterious woods near my house. The woods had always been off-limits. Rumors of strange sounds, missing animals, and even sightings of shadowy figures lingered in town, but we thought it was all just a myth. Armed with flashlights and a naive sense of invincibility, we waited until midnight to leave. Slipping out through my bedroom window, I met my friends, Jake, Sarah, and Emma, who were waiting for me on the street. The air was thick with humidity, and the night was eerily quiet as we made our way toward the woods. The further we walked, the more the sounds of civilization faded, replaced by the occasional rustling of leaves or distant hoot of an owl. As we entered the dense forest, the trees seemed to close in around us, their twisted branches creating unsettling shapes against the night sky. But we laughed it off, pretending not to be scared. After all, we were just sneaking out for a little fun, right? But the deeper we went, the more we started to feel it, the unsettling sensation that we weren't alone. Jake, always the skeptic, was the first to brush off our growing anxiety. But then, Emma stopped in her tracks. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. We all froze, listening intently. At first, there was nothing, just the usual sounds of the forest at night. But then, faintly, we heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper, coming from somewhere deep within the woods. It was impossible to tell what it was saying, but it sounded like someone, or something, was calling us. We shined our flashlights in the direction of the sound, but the dense underbrush made it impossible to see anything clearly. Sarah suggested we turn back, but Jake insisted on pushing forward, claiming it was probably just the wind or some animal. Reluctantly, we followed. But as we walked, the whispering grew louder, more insistent, and closer. Now, it sounded as though it was all around us, coming from every direction. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my heart began to race. I wanted to turn back, but something about the whispering compelled us forward, as if we were being drawn deeper into the woods against our will. Suddenly, Sarah let out a blood-curdling scream. She pointed her flashlight to the left, and we all saw it, a figure standing just beyond the trees. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its body was shadowy, almost blending into the darkness of the forest. We couldn't make out any facial features, but its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, piercing through the night. Panic set in, and we turned to run, but no matter which direction we went, the figure seemed to be there, watching, waiting. The whispering grew deafening, as if it was inside our heads, urging us to keep moving deeper into the woods. Finally, we found a narrow path and bolted toward it, running as fast as we could. We didn't stop until we were back on the street, breathless and drenched in sweat. When we turned around, the figure was gone, and the whispering had stopped. None of us said a word as we walked home in silence, too terrified to process what had just happened. The next day, we heard on the news that a man had gone missing in those woods. His body was never found. We never spoke about that night again, and none of us ever dared to sneak out again. Sneaking out was a thrill that my friends and I often indulged in during our teenage years. It was all about the rush of doing something forbidden, something that felt dangerous. But the night we decided to sneak into the old abandoned house at the end of our street was the night everything changed. The house had been vacant for years, ever since the elderly couple who owned it had passed away. It was falling apart, with broken windows, a sagging roof, and overgrown weeds consuming the yard. Rumor had it that the house was haunted, but we didn't believe in ghosts, at least not until that night. It was a Friday night, and my friends, Tom, Liz, and I, had decided to sneak out and explore the house. We waited until our parents were asleep, then crept out of our homes and met up in front of the old place. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the only light came from the flickering street lamp down the road. The house loomed in front of us like a shadow, its broken windows staring down at us like empty eyes. We hesitated at the front gate, but Tom, always the brave one, pushed it open with a loud creak. We followed him up the overgrown path and onto the porch, where the wooden boards groaned under our weight. With a deep breath, Tom turned the handle of the front door, and it swung open with a loud, echoing creak. The air inside was cold, unnaturally so, and it smelled musty, like a place that hadn't been touched in years. We stepped inside, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The interior was just as dilapidated as the outside, peeling wallpaper, dust-covered furniture, and cobwebs hanging from the ceiling. But it wasn't the state of the house that made my skin crawl, it was the feeling that we weren't alone. As we explored the first floor, we heard strange noises, footsteps, whispering, and the occasional thump from upstairs. But every time we checked, there was no one there. Liz suggested we leave, but Tom insisted on going upstairs. Reluctantly, we followed him up the creaky staircase, our flashlights flickering as we reached the top. At the end of the hallway was a door, slightly ajar. A dim light flickered from within, casting long shadows on the walls. We exchanged nervous glances, but curiosity got the better of us, and we slowly approached the door. As Tom pushed it open, we saw what looked like a figure standing by the window, its back turned to us. Before any of us could speak, the figure turned around, revealing a face twisted in rage. It let out a blood-curdling scream, and the lights in the house flickered violently. We didn't wait to see what happened next, we ran. The stairs seemed longer on the way down, the front door further away than before. But we finally made it outside, gasping for air as we stumbled onto the street. When we turned back to look at the house, the figure was standing on the porch, watching us with glowing red eyes. We never spoke of that night again, and the house was eventually torn down. But I'll never forget the terror of that figure, and the feeling that it's still watching, waiting for us to return. When my cousin and I were staying with our grandparents for the summer, we had one rule: never sneak out at night. Our grandparents' farmhouse was old, surrounded by miles of open fields and thick woods, and our grandmother insisted it wasn't safe after dark. But we were rebellious teenagers, and the thrill of breaking the rules was too tempting to resist. One night, after our grandparents had gone to bed, we decided to sneak out and explore the woods behind the house. We had heard stories about strange things happening in those woods, lights, noises, and even sightings of strange creatures, but we didn't believe any of it. It was just a fun way to kill time. We slipped out the back door, flashlights in hand, and made our way into the woods. The air was cool, and the sound of crickets filled the night. At first, it was exciting, like we were on an adventure. But the further we went, the more uneasy we became. The woods were darker than we expected, the trees casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. And then, we heard it, a low, guttural growl, coming from somewhere in the darkness. We stopped in our tracks, our hearts pounding. We shined our flashlights in the direction of the sound, but saw nothing. My cousin suggested we turn back, but I insisted on pressing forward, convinced it was just an animal. But then, we heard the growl again, closer this time, followed by the sound of something large moving through the trees. We turned to run, but it was too late. Suddenly, a figure stepped out from the shadows, blocking our path. It was tall, its body covered in dark, matted fur, and its eyes glowed a bright, unnatural yellow. It let out a low growl, and we froze in terror. For what felt like an eternity, we stood there, staring at the creature, too terrified to move. Then, without warning, it lunged at us. We screamed and bolted back toward the farmhouse, the creature's heavy footsteps pounding behind us. We made it back to the house just as the creature reached the edge of the woods. It stopped, watching us with those glowing eyes, but didn't follow us any further. We slammed the door behind us, panting and shaking, and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, we told our grandparents what had happened, but they didn't seem surprised. "Now you understand why we told you not to go out at night," our grandmother said, her voice calm but serious. "We never snuck out again, and to this day, I still wonder what that creature was, and why it didn't follow us home." These stories remind us that sometimes, breaking the rules can lead to encounters with things beyond our understanding. It's a lesson in caution, and a reminder that some places, and some things, are better left unexplored.